Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we have an exciting book club episode. We have Dr. Carl Trueman back on the show, as well as Dr. Bruce Gordon, and they're going to be talking about their brand new book, Handbook of Calvin and Calvinism. It's published by Oxford University Press. So we're going to jump right into that here in a moment with Peter. Just before we do that, as a reminder to you guys, we got some links on the show notes. And on some of those links, you'll find the Society of Reformed Podcasters. Those are a group of other like-minded Reformed podcasts out there. If you like our show and what we talk about, you'll probably like theirs, as well as a couple links to find a Reformed church near you. That's the most important thing, to find a church to call home. There's some local church finders, as well as one Peter is going to start here in about a year, here in Orange County, California. And then you're going to obviously find a link to Oxford University Press. This is where you can actually click on and purchase this book for yourselves, because I know you're going to love it. After listening to this conversation, you're probably going to want to purchase it right away. So without further ado, let's jump right in and introduce Dr. Gordon and Dr. Trueman to the show.
Yeah, in case you guys haven't listened to our podcast or listened to any other podcasts these guys have been on, Bruce Gordon is the Titus Street Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Yale Divinity School, and Carl Trueman is Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Grove City College, and also the co-host of the popular podcast Mortification of Spin. And we're talking about their book, The Oxford Handbook of Calvin and Calvinism. So thanks for coming back on, Dr. Trueman, and coming on for the first time, Dr. Gordon.
Thank you. Pleasure.
I was going to ask to make a joke. So how many yachts have you bought since last November, Dr. Trueman? Since the absolute explosive success of your book.
I've been focusing on wingtip shoes and fountain pens, actually. It's been a good year. It's been a good year in the Trueman household.
Good. I'm glad. And I was going to tell Dr. Gordon, I mean, we talked a little bit about this before recording, but your biography on Calvin in 2009 was really influential kind of on me and learning more about Calvin. So thanks for that. And thanks for coming on too.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. But Carl is very much the materialist of our relationship.
That's right. Yeah.
We're talking before we hit record how you guys met. You can maybe explain that to the audience, and how it definitely beats how Peter and I met.
Yeah, we met through CrossFit. People have heard us through CrossFit, but yeah, if you guys want a brief description of how you guys know each other and how you guys came to write this book or edit this book together.
Well, I can do the initial meeting and Bruce can do the book, I guess. Bruce and I met in 1988, I think it was. We were both postgraduates in Scotland at the time. Bruce was at the University of St Andrews. I was at the University of Aberdeen. And the four ancient universities would have a church history reading party each year where students and faculty could go and present papers and engage in informal discussion. And it was actually at a Redemptorist monastery in Perth. So Bruce and I met in a creepy old monastery. And my lasting memories of the time there are, one, the food was terrible and there wasn't enough of it. But there was a pub in the town that we could all retreat to after the business of the day and supplement the calories in a liquid fashion. So I've actually known Bruce longer than I've known my wife. My oldest academic friend, I guess.
Yes, I appreciate the oldest part. But what I remember very clearly was that we were at this weekend, and we spent on the Saturday afternoon, we went for a walk in this town of Perth, and Carl explained to me that as he was a very strict Sabbatarian, he would not be attending any of the sessions on Sunday. So,
I'd forgotten that. I've moved a little since then.
Carl's penchant for moral superiority was evident even then.
It hasn't changed.
No, it hasn't changed at all.
I'd forgotten that. Oh man, I'd never have agreed to do the book with you if I knew you were going to throw that out there.
That's right.
I've been
Yeah.
waiting 30 years to tell that story.
Yeah, it happens 2021. Finally, on an interview, yeah, you get to tell them what you think.
Finally, I've been able to unburden myself with that story.
Though if my mother-in-law heard that anecdote, she would be hugely impressed. So you may actually have boosted my cred in the family.
That's right. You were.
That's funny. And then, yeah, how'd you guys come to the book together? What was that process?
I think we were approached by Oxford.
You were approached, and then you approached me. I think.
Yeah, I approached, and I think my answer was, I don't really know very much about Calvin. I need to call on my friend Bruce Gordon to co-edit it with me. So the book arose, really, Oxford do this. I think it's a great series, their handbook series, because they're not dictionaries or the typical sort of primers that often handbook series are. They're substantial volumes that often cover sort of the cutting edge names in the scholarship in a single volume. So it was attractive to be involved in a project that would pull a lot of names together. And I think one of the things that when Bruce and I discussed it early on, we decided that there were two things, I think, Bruce, that we thought to do strategically. One, we didn't want to do yet another book on Calvin and Calvinism that covered the usual topics, Calvin on predestination, Calvin on church-state relations. We wanted to do a book that had a good sweep, but also offered some unusual and interesting angles on Calvinism, world Calvinism. Hence the sections on Calvinism in other countries, Africa, China, places like that. And the other thing we wanted to do is we were very aware that when we were young academics, senior academics had given us breaks that had allowed us to publish things that had helped us in our careers. And we didn't just want to get the usual suspects in to write for the book. We also wanted to pull on the younger talent. Bruce, therefore, I think you pulled in some of your former postgrads. I had a couple of my former postgrads.
I had to explain to some of my friends who work on Calvin why they weren't invited to be part of this volume. When the volume came out, all sorts of people, they wrote to me and said, I thought that I worked on Calvin. Why am I not in the Oxford Handbook of Calvin and Calvinism? Yeah, and I it's precisely what Carl said, that there are various volumes which are Calvin and that's not what we wanted to do. We wanted to invite a different cast of people to write on things like Calvin and Shakespeare, Calvin and Milton, Calvin on Calvin and early exploration of the Americas, on Calvin on ghosts, Calvin on the devil, but also the weight of the volume is much more towards Calvinism, and that's the term that we might want to discuss. But then Calvin, Calvin makes a relatively short appearance at the beginning, but for the most part, we invited people who were at the beginning of their career rather than people who've been writing on this for 30 years, like Carl and I.
Yeah, I mean, so kind of getting back to Dr. Gordon, so your background in the books that you've written on Calvin too. So what got you into Calvin and writing on Reformation history?
This is an accidental story. I was visited by the editor of Yale University Press. She came to see me when I was in my office in St. Andrews, and she asked me what I was doing. And she got her pen out and notebook and said, tell me what you're working on. So I described to her very earnestly what I was interested in, and I noticed she wasn't taking any notes. And I thought, this isn't going very well. So I just gave up at one point and said, is there something you have in mind? And she said, yes, 2009 is coming up, which is the anniversary of Calvin's birth, and we're looking for someone to write a biography of Calvin, which I've always maintained that I worked on the Swiss Reformation, but not Calvin. And so I found myself enlisted to do something that I thought I had no background in, but that gave me, I thought, the opportunity to be slightly outside the guild and write about Calvin from a different perspective, which was largely to write about Calvin from those people who knew him rather than from someone who focuses on Calvin directly, which is what I tried to do, which was to see Calvin, at least in part, as other people saw him.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I guess my question would be, if you're listening to this podcast right now and somehow you found your way to a reformed pod in your car and our show just magically popped up and you're thinking, well, who's Calvin? They haven't even addressed who this Calvin guy is. How could you please just introduce who John Calvin is to our audience? We'll start there.
Carl, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, Calvin is probably the most significant of what's often referred to as the second generation of reformers. He's born in 1509. He comes to maturity, therefore, in a world that's already being reshaped by the technological developments and the theological developments that mark the 16th century. He is an interesting figure in that he spends much of his life in exile. He's sometimes referred to, I've heard him referred to as a Swiss reformer. And as Bruce has already said, he does the Swiss Reformation, not Calvin. Calvin is a Frenchman, spends much of his adult life and career in exile, particularly in the city of Geneva. And he's perhaps most famous for two things. Controversially, he's popularly known as the man who burned Michael Servetus, the notorious anti-Trinitarian heretic. So if he pops up in popular culture, it's typically as a kind of 16th century Ayatollah Khomeini sort of figure, leading this alleged brutal theocracy in Geneva and persecuting poor people like Servetus. And he also produced one of the great, I think Bruce may want to qualify this, but I would say one of the great theological and literary masterpieces of the 16th century in his Institutes, which is, it's not a systematic theology, but it is an attempt, I think, to present theology in a synthesized and concise way that helps people read the scriptures. Often in his commentaries, he will make allusions to the Institutes as a source for gaining clarity on particular theological doctrines. And the Institutes has come down as one of the great theological classics. So Calvin, 16th century Frenchman, spent much of his time in exile, I think had a profound formative influence on the development of the modern French language, and also placed his stamp upon the Reformed tradition. Now, the Reformed tradition is not like the Lutheran tradition. I think we make a mistake if we allow the term Calvinism to capture our imagination and think that Calvin plays the same role in the Reformed tradition that Luther does in Lutheranism.
Yeah,
Calvin is not so much the founder of the feast as he is perhaps in the long run the most significant formulator and thinker relative to the Reformed tradition. Bruce, have I given a relatively accurate account?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important that we don't diminish Calvin by acknowledging that he was the inheritor of a tradition, which was, if I can plug my book on Huldrych Zwingli, which was, Huldrych Zwingli, who was the reformer in Zurich, for a contemporary of Luther, so the 1520s. He is in many ways the person who creates this tradition of what we would call the Reformed tradition, with its perspectives on the sacraments, the covenant, and many other things that become tenets of the Reformed tradition. So Calvin will certainly revise it and expand it and do various things within, but Calvin comes into a tradition, as Carl said, that already exists. By the time Calvin moves towards Protestantism, Zwingli's already been dead. He dies in 1531. Calvin hasn't yet left France and become an evangelical. So it's somewhat confusing when we talk about the great reformers. If we think that they all existed at the same time, they didn't. Calvin comes in, as Carl said, in the second generation. So there's already a Protestant Reformation when Calvin enters into it. when he travels to Switzerland, having fled France as a refugee, he encounters a reformed church. He sees what a reformed liturgy looks like. He learns what a reformed theology is. He will, in many ways, become the public face of it, but he doesn't invent it.
And I think it's fair to say as well, Bruce, that in his own lifetime, he's arguably not obviously the most influential Reformed theologian. I think in England, Heinrich Bullinger, for example, Zwingli's successor in Zurich, his book, his Decades, which is his sort of, for want of a better term, equivalent of the Institutes, is actually a more popular theological textbook than the Institutes in 16th century England.
This is important that Calvin, our perspective on the Reformation is not necessarily their perspective on the Reformation. Calvin certainly became a very prominent figure, but Calvin never existed in isolation. He existed in a network of people on whom he was highly dependent, including, as Carl says, Heinrich Bullinger, who was Zwingli's reform successor in Zurich, but there were other people like Martin Bucer, and Guillaume Farel. There was Pierre Viret. There was a whole circle of people who were mutually dependent on each other, and Calvin was part of this network. He used to send his work to other people to be read and to get feedback on. He didn't necessarily always like the feedback he got from other people. So our sense of kind of Calvinism, which Carl hints at as this being this singular figure of singular influence, is historically a misrepresentation. Which is not to diminish Calvin as a figure, but rather to put him in his proper context.
Yeah.
And he's so much more than just tulip, right?
Oh, yes. Well, as I said in my biography of Calvin, one of my favorite lines in my biography of Calvin, if I could say this, is that Calvin never saw a tulip in his life.
That's right. Yeah. Tulip was a response to the Remonstrance, and that was what 70 years after Calvin himself. So even we were talking beforehand too in pre-record with kind of the differentiation between Calvinism and kind of Reformation in total. So if you can define, so why Calvin and Calvinism, and how does that differ from Reformed tradition, or does it differ? Isn't it like an umbrella term? So if you can define kind of those terms, why those are distinguished.
I think to a large extent, I mean, it sounds rather specious response, but to a large extent, it depends how you're using the term Calvinism. If you remember back to the rise of the so-called young, restless, and reformed 12, 13 years ago, figures like Mark Driscoll, etc., are being characterized as Calvinistic. And by and large, it seems to me that what was meant there was not even the 5 points, the so-called tulip of Calvinism. What was meant was a kind of basic commitment to a kind of anti-Pelagian understanding of salvation. So there are some very loose ways of using the term Calvinism. Typically, I think I would say that what we more appropriately call Calvinism, which is the ecclesiastical tradition that seeks to represent the Reformed faith, is defined often by, well, in terms of Presbyterianism, the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Catechisms, and in terms of the continental tradition, the Canons of Dort, the Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism. None of those documents, of course, were written by Calvin, but I think it's arguable that there's very little in those documents that Calvin would have taken exception to. So I think Calvinism can be just a synonym for the Reformed tradition when we're thinking confessionally. In more popular circles, it tends to mean an anti-Pelagian view of salvation, neither of which track back directly, immediately, and perfectly to Calvin himself. I think it's a term that is broadly used, and what we did in the book was we tried to respect that breadth of meaning as well. And when we came to the Calvinism section of the book, we're not looking at, okay, who uses Calvin in their thinking. We're thinking in much broader terms. I think they're thinking of the Reformed faith as such.
I think, the term Calvinism was invented while Calvin was still alive. And in his lectures on the book of Daniel, which was at the very end of his life, he says, people speak of Calvinism. And he says, there's no such thing. There are no Calvinists. We are Christians. And, Zwingli had faced the same thing when he was accused of being a Lutheran. Reformed is in some ways preferable because it respects the diversity of the tradition in a way that Calvinism seems to preclude. And, if we're going to talk about the Reformed tradition, we have to think about Arminianism. We have to think about the liberal tradition of the Reformed in the 19th century. We have to think about Karl Barth. Are you going to call Karl Barth a Calvinist? Well, that becomes a very problematic issue. Emil Brunner, who regarded himself in the Reformed tradition, do we see him as a Calvinist? Brunner and Barth, of course, famously disagreed on what Calvin actually said. And so, we say that in our introduction, that although this is the Oxford Handbook of Calvin and Calvinism, it is probably more historically and theologically responsible to speak about it in terms of Reformed, because it's not monocausal. It's a tradition that has many different lines to it, and what is fascinating is that many people will claim Calvin, but they're claiming a very different Calvin when they read him in very different ways and claim his inheritance. So, you get to the point of, will the real Calvin please stand up?
And I mean, if you look at a character like John Owen in the 17th century, who might popularly be referred to as the greatest Calvinist theologian in England in the 17th century, I think it's true to say that he cites Augustine and Aquinas far more frequently and regularly than he does John Calvin. So again, that goes to Bruce's comment that not only is the Reformed tradition, if you like, pluriform in terms of 16th and 17th century figures, it's also Catholic in a way that points back before the Reformation and draws on what we would now call patristic and medieval sources for its formulations. So Calvinism is in some ways, it's a mischievous word. If you allow it to take on a life of its own, it's a mischievous word. If you roughly translate it as Reformed tradition, I think you don't go too far wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, when I was doing this book on Calvin's Institutes, I spoke to Carl about this, and we were talking about the Synod of Dort. And one of the things he pointed out to me, which was very helpful, was that at the Synod of Dort, Theodore Beza, who's Calvin's successor in Geneva, is cited many more times than John Calvin is. And one of the things you have to always be careful about is citing somebody doesn't mean the same thing that they are influential. It means that you cite somebody because they have a kind of cachet. It sounds good if you cite John Calvin. That doesn't mean that you're actually influenced by him.
Interesting.
Jonathan Edwards cites Calvin all over the place, but Jonathan Edwards' theology you would not say is the same as John Calvin's.
Very different.
In fact, he's in argument with John Calvin a lot of the time. So it's very, very dangerous to draw straight lines of influence.
Yeah, and so I mean, kind of coming into Calvin's background, so understanding our terms between this. What is, maybe kind of in a broad sense, maybe as concise as you can be, what is Calvin born into theologically and culturally, and what does he kind of give to the 17th century? And do they kind of hold on to what Calvin's teaching, Calvin's context, or is it morphing, switching into something else?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think one of the great contributions I think that Calvin makes in the Reformation is biblical commentary. If you try to read Martin Bucer biblical commentary, for example, it's incredibly long-winded and at points I think very garbled. Calvin produces a form of biblical commentary that it doesn't always represent the brevity and clarity that I think he aspires to. But I think one of Calvin's great contributions in the 16th century, and indeed I think to the church in general, are the biblical commentaries that he produced, that he deployed the best literary skills of the kind of Erasmian humanism that fostered him, and deployed those with remarkable acumen and skill relative to expounding the biblical text. So that's one of the things I would say, that when you think about the Reformation, often we think, for example, if Erasmus is the bad guy because we read the Reformation as Protestants through the lens of Luther in 1525. I think when you look at Calvin, you see, again, much better fruits of Erasmianism coming into Protestantism at that point. And his literary skill, I think, is the thing that most impresses me.
Yeah.
I think, I absolutely agree with that. I think if you think about Luther or any of the other reformers, Melanchthon, what Calvin was really able to do was to articulate a theological, ecclesiological vision of striking clarity. He emphasized the sovereignty of God, which was a God of a providential God, a God of predestination, whatever you might make of that. But he articulated a God who was in covenant with God's people. And for a changing society of the 16th century, a society of enormous tumult, and into the 17th century of endless religious wars, Calvin gave, and I think, again, I would say, following from Zwingli and others, gave a very clear account of the church, of the sacraments, of the relationship of humanity to God through a covenantal relationship, of a God who is present in the world, present in history, a God who never abandons those who are in exile or refugees, because the Reformed Calvinist tradition is very much associated with refugees in the 16th and 17th century, as it is into the New World. I think one of the great strengths of the Reformed tradition, and perhaps also its weakness, but its strengths is its clarity of vision, which simply isn't there in Lutheranism. It isn't there in other articulations of it. Calvin is, as Carl says, an extraordinarily lucid writer who is able to explain in ways that people are able to understand. He has a knack for making the complex very, very discernible.
Yeah, and for much of what we know of Calvin and his teachings and his writings and his works, was initially what Calvin was doing, was that in a response to an opposing view, or was he more just kind of re-clarifying or refreshing reformational theology? Or maybe a little bit of both, because I know that he could have definitely been counteracting some opposing views as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things about the Institutes, I mean, the Institutes goes through 5 and 6 editions during his life, up until the 1559, which is the one we always read in the English translation, which is when the work is divided into 4 books. That book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, is very much a kind of spiritual autobiography of Calvin. He begins it in 1536 when he's virtually an unknown refugee in Basel. He writes this little work, which becomes a success. Right? He revises it again and again and again in both its Latin and French forms. He's doing it often in terms of the various fights he gets into, whether it's with, over the doctrine of justification, or over anti-Trinitarianism, or Servetus, as Carl has already mentioned, the nature of Christ. So the book grows as he's involved in these various disputes, but it also grows. Calvin never studied theology. He doesn't have a theological degree. He didn't, unlike Luther, who was a professor of Bible, Calvin studied the arts and he studied law. He never studied theology at university. He's an autodidact. He studied it himself. And so his institutes grows over the years as he's studying, and we can follow his course of study, whether he's reading the church fathers, he's reading the theologians of the Middle Ages, he's reading all sorts of things. So the book grows as he grows. So the book is like is constantly in process, as Calvin is a person who's constantly in the process of becoming Calvin. So he's writing against things, but he's also, he's preaching 5 times a week. He's writing these biblical commentaries, as Carl talks about. He's writing these tracts. As he grows, the book grows, and to become this very expansive view of doctrine. Calvin never liked the word theology. He preferred the word doctrine because he thought theology he associated with the sort of medieval academic institutions. He preferred the word doctrine, which, and the Institutes was to become, in his view, as he says in the introduction to the 1559 edition, it is his summary of doctrine. It's a summary of what we can know. It's the summary of revelation in Scripture. And so, but it comes out of a life of study and preaching and pastoral care, and also fighting with various opponents. So it's the book is a very existential book. It's about him and his evolution as a Christian.
Yeah. And so kind of going more macro too, just for, kind of with the book structure itself, it's not structured, I think, how many people are expecting coming into the book, where it's just about Calvin's life. Let's talk about his theology. Let's talk about his context, his background. But it kind of goes from before Calvin, what is he born into? And it goes up into the present days. What was the thought process behind structuring the book this way, finding the editor, finding those who wrote the different chapters, and bringing this structurally from the 1500s until present day?
I think a major driver was the thought that Calvinism has been a huge, the Reformed faith has been a huge influence on so many areas of culture and so many places across the world. In some ways, I often think about the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was in some ways the quintessentially English document. It's the document being forged during a time of the English Civil War under the authority of the English Parliament. And yet it has almost no impact in England whatsoever. Yet it's taken very seriously in Korea today, in places like that. So part of, I think, the agenda with the book was to try to bring to people's attention how this, in some sense, quintessentially European movement or European set of ideas actually had a huge impact across the globe, and also in a whole variety of different areas. Calvinism has clearly played a large role in reflections on church and state over the years, because one of Calvin's major struggles in Geneva in some ways focused on the respective rights, authorities, spheres of church and state. So there was that dimension to it. The rise of the legitimation of rebellion cannot be understood in isolation from strands of the Reformed tradition. And then you get to things like in the 18th century, the great revivals that marked English, Scottish, and North American culture in remarkable ways. Some of the key players in those were those who would have identified in some way as being heirs of the Reformed tradition. Jonathan Edwards has been mentioned, and of course, George Whitefield on the English Methodist side. And then when you move into the 19th century, European politics is profoundly affected by disruptions within Calvinistic churches. You have the 1843 disruption in the Church of Scotland, leading to the founding of the Free Church, the Sabbatarian denomination to which I belong, that meant I didn't go to things on a Sunday in 1988. And you have a couple of major church splits in the Netherlands relative to Reformed tradition. You have the Afscheiding of 1834, and then you have the Doleantie at the later part of the 19th century. So Calvinism profoundly shapes European politics even into the 19th century. So I think what was driving the breadth of the book was an attempt to try to demonstrate the the intellectual, cultural, and geographical reach of the Reformed faith / Calvinism right down to the present day. And the commission for the book, of course, came in the sort of the wake of, I can't remember if it was Time magazine or somebody declaring Calvinism to be a sort of rising and significant force in American culture.
Yeah.
That seems like a millennium ago now.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
But you know, if we're going to say that, I mean, you know, we're all sitting here in the States at the moment, but you know, I think one thing the book wanted to reflect is, you know, in truth be told, the future of Calvinism or the Reformed faith is probably in the majority world now.
Yeah.
It's in Asia, it's in Africa, it's where it's growing exponentially.
Yeah.
And continues to grow as a global faith. And that's something the book wanted to reflect, is that this is not just a European, North American story. Where if we now think about Reformed Christianity, we think about churches in Seoul, we think about churches in Africa, we think about churches in Indonesia, we think about churches, you know, that are not necessarily the ones that we're most familiar with, but ones in which where you know the growth of you know, and we think about the borders between, you know, the Reformed tradition and Pentecostalism. One of our chapters about Ghana in the book, you know, talks about how, you know, there is this sort of porous border between Reformed and Pentecostalism. Well, this is the new reality of global Reformed religion, and our kind of perhaps more locked into denominationalism doesn't make a lot of sense to people beyond our borders.
Yeah, so kind of, I mean, digging into that a little bit more on my end with the structure. What was a chapter in the book that both for you and you think for listeners or for readers are going to strike them as surprising, saying I wasn't expecting this from Calvin or Calvinism?
Yeah, I think the chapter, I'm just trying to find the title. Where is it? Yeah, I think it's Enchanted Calvinism, Healing and Deliverance in the Presbyterian Church of Ghana. I mean, Bruce has already alluded to that.
Yeah.
I think for me, that was one of the more surprising chapters.
Yeah.
And again, showing Calvinism transposed into an African context. From a sort of intellectual historian's perspective, I think the article by Annette Aubert, Old Princeton and European Scholarship, is significant, because the old Princeton story as told by Americans is typically the story of Scottish common sense realism.
Yep.
Whereas what Annette does in her article is show how American Calvinism of the old Princeton variety cannot be separated from this interesting dialogue with German theology, which makes perfect sense, because Charles Hodge, B.B. Warfield and company, they studied in Germany, right down to J. Gresham Machen, of course, in the 20th century. Germany was a standard port of call on the cursus honorum for American conservative Calvinist theologians. So I think from the intellectual historian's point of view, I found Annette's article interesting, because I think that opens up a new angle on understanding the German influence on American Calvinism in the 19th century. Everybody knows Mercersburg is shaped by German theology. Old Princeton, not so much. So the Ghana chapter and the Old Princeton chapter, those would be my two sort of picks. Yeah, they made me think. They made me really think.
What about you, Dr. Gordon?
You know, the chapter on Ghana, I'm very attracted to, because I read his book on Enchanted Calvinism, and that's what, you know, excited me to invite him to contribute the chapter. I think, I mean, there are various ones. There are lots of them in there that I find fascinating. William Dyres's book on chapter on visual Calvinism. Brad Holden's chapter on Milton and Calvinism, Claire McEachran's chapter on Calvin and Shakespeare, which is not a combination that's often made.
Yeah.
I think what I appreciated about a lot of the chapters through right to the end, Shannon Craig O'Snell's article on this, is that it's not a book of reverence. It's not a book of, how great thou art about John Calvin. It's a book that often challenges our view of the preeminence of both Calvin and Calvinism. And I think what I appreciate, the chapters through Brazil and Korea, is that there's no easy narrative here of Calvin and Calvinism. And in many times it's shown to be, not entirely what we might have imagined it to be. And I think that going back to Carl's earlier point, I think that was one of the rewards of choosing people who are not necessarily in the guild of writing about Calvin. Barbara Pitkin's article is fantastic on historical, Calvin and historical thought. But many of our people who bring a different perspective to Calvin, to realize that in many ways it's deeply problematic, as well as a foundation of modern thought and modern Christianity in many ways. But our authors don't hesitate to point out where the problems are, and I think that's what I greatly appreciate.
Yeah,
many of, if not all of the essays, are models of a kind of appreciative but critical history.
Yeah, those tend to be some of the best books, biography wise too. You get it's not hagiography. It's let's dig deep into this, peel back the layers.
Yeah, there are many articles in this book that, I would have no hesitation in pointing talented students to and saying, if you want to know how to write history about something you love, but you want to have a perspective on it, then many of these articles provide models, I think, for how a young academic might want to sort of start shaping their approach to writing and thinking about historical topics.
Yeah.
As far as Calvin's teachings, what's something that is, you would say, universally accepted by reformers, the Reformed Church, and what's maybe something in Calvin's teachings that's more maybe generally debated amongst reformers, including us as reformers in our churches today?
I mean, I think that question points towards one of the great things about Calvin, of course, is by and large his lack of originality on the theological front. I mean, I'm almost inclined to be facetious and say, the great original theologian in Geneva in the 16th century was Michael Servetus, and they burned him because of his originality. I mean, so much of what Calvin holds to, I would say, is the stock in trade of small c Catholic mere Christianity. Doctrine of the Trinity, the Incarnation, these things where Calvin offers a brilliant summation of what is general, basic, mere Christian truth. I think, and Bruce may have a different view on this, I think one of the things that even among self-identifying Calvinist or Reformed people that may be debated is his view of the Lord's Supper. My impression of a lot of those who identify as Calvinists today is they're probably closer to a kind of memorialist position, which is more typically, I hesitate to say it's Zwinglian because Bruce knows a whole lot more about Zwingli than I do, but it's typically imputed to Zwingli.
No, there's no question. Zwingli won.
It's easier to understand for a start. The simpler guy tends to win in history. But I would say the place perhaps where most Calvinists perhaps don't realize that they're not really Calvinists is in a rather low view of the Lord's Supper, which is not Calvin's view at all. So that might be my choice of, normally people go for predestination, but I'm going to go for, I think, the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is one point where even a lot of fans of Calvin might be surprised to realize they're not actually with him on that when they read those sections.
I think the challenge, I agree very much with what Carl says, just to say something, slightly different. I think, Nick, your question is where I think in many ways you can go back to first principles and talk about the sovereignty of God. And I think the whole issue of divine determinism is still for many Reformed deeply problematic. Get back to questions of, did God will sin? And which is what Calvin's opponents said he was saying, that God is the author of sin. What does it mean to have the sovereignty of God, and a God who is providential, who is all things unfold according to divine plan? What does that mean for disasters? What does that mean for horrible things that happen in human history? What does that mean for the relationship of humanity and sin? To what extent did humans actually have a choice in being sinful, or was it willed by God? I think these questions, which in some ways sound quite abstract, are still very much central to those who are trying to work out the Reformed tradition, across the spectrum from the more liberal to the more conservative. I've read all the stuff that talks about divine determinism, but it's still very much an open question, and still, I think, a challenge for anybody who's trying to explicate Reformed theology in the modern world.
Yeah. So my last question on this would be thinking more towards those either broadly Reformed or kind of into the Reformed faith, asking questions about it. Or those who have a decent grasp of this. What's something about Calvin that most people either don't think about or either have wrong, that could help them towards a better view of, okay, this is who Calvin was, this is his influence on us, and how we can better think about Calvin. So something new for people, or something we generally attribute to Calvin that shouldn't be attributed or should be changed in some way.
I think the Servetus incident is more complicated than people typically allow. I mean, the myth of Calvin as the sort of murderous psychopath who's determined to kill Servetus is simply not an accurate account of the situation. The other side of it, I think, is Calvin's personal piety. The prayers that Calvin's prayers, I think, are rather beautiful, and I use them. I teach a Doctrine of God class at Grove, and I try to end each class with a classic prayer from church history. And some of Calvin's prayers are very affecting and beautiful. That's not to wash away the sins or the problems of the man, but to say that he isn't just an arid theologian. There's a vital personal piety that he can give expression to in and through his prayers. So if I wanted to make Calvin attractive to people, I would press his prayers upon them. And the same as I would do with Thomas Aquinas, actually. He's another one where I tell the students, first thing to read about Aquinas, get hold of some of his prayers and read his prayers, and that will set you up then for reading some of the heavier tomes.
I would agree with that, and say, and take it in a slightly different direction, and say that the great success of Calvin's opponents was to portray him as an intractable, uncompromising figure. And
interesting.
And whatever you think of Calvin, that's just not right. Calvin believed one of his firmest convictions was that there could be unity of the visible church. And he believed that that unity did not involve absolute agreement on every single issue, whether it was forms of worship, whether it was questions of doctrine, or even interpretations of Bible. He writes in his preface to his 1539 commentary on Romans, he talks about Butzer, and he talks about various other people, and he says, we all do this quite different ways, and that's fine, because we're all committed to the truth. But within that, there can still be considerable difference. And when the English refugees who were in the Church of Frankfurt wrote when they were debating about liturgical issues, things that we might not regard as particularly significant, but they were caught up in a debate about them. They wrote to Calvin and said, please adjudicate who's right here. And Calvin wrote back and said, don't make a Rome of Geneva. What we do here is because this is what we do. What you do there is because what you do there. Calvin had, I think, a remarkable sense of the Catholicity of the church. And that is that it is a body that is united by a confession of Christ and of the word and of what is essential. But within that body, there would be considerable diversity of practice and of belief and the way in which things were done. And I think people have lost sense of Calvin as, not in necessarily a modern sense, but as an ecumenical figure of what the Catholic Church would look like. He believed it would include, the Lutherans, it would include, now he did draw the line at Catholics, he did draw the line at Anabaptists, but he still had an expansive view of what the church could be within its differences. And I think that's something of Calvin that has been entirely lost.
I think I haven't heard much about his, in a sense, his inclusiveness to those who still profess the same Christ and the same confessions.
Yeah, that's not to make him a modern liberal.
Totally.
But it's to make a sense that he has a much more expansive view of what the Christian church was than the kind of the person who sat in Geneva and threw thunderbolts.
That's right. Yeah. I don't know, Nick, if you have anything else to add too.
Oh, not much. I mean, I think just going down maybe another question about clarification through comparison would be, a lot of people when they Google Calvin, the most opposing view would be Arminianism, and you'd see a picture of Calvin and then the other picture of, so the opposing view, what would, I think maybe the most surface level way of explaining it would be predestination is probably what most people think the opposing view is. But maybe just in a quick, concise way, could you explain the most popular opposing view today when it comes to Arminianism?
Not quite sure what you're getting at there, Nick.
Oh, sure. We can edit that part out. I'll have Peter edit that part out. It's okay. I was kind of getting lost in my question anyway.
Are you thinking, I can edit this, but are you thinking of the most common misperception or of Calvin, or what were you thinking?
No, what I was trying to do is just on the most opposite, people kind of paint this picture of his like arch nemesis on opposing views, and Arminianism would be that what most people find. Like if you just Googled Calvin, that's what comes up is his most opposing person that came after him and tried to counteract what he was saying. So we can edit that part out. Don't worry about it.
Cool. Good. Cool. So I'll have a quick little pause and then I'll ask my final kind of wrap.
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
Cool. So the last question I usually ask our guests, and so I'm assuming, and this is it's a big volume, so they're not just going to get it over in a week and say, okay, what do we have next to read? But so what other resources that do you guys have that can be helpful along this path on learning kind of the Reformed tradition or this cultural background stuff? And what is there anything that you're working on that you can promote to say, hey, if you like this, then you guys might also like this too?
Well, not sparing Bruce's blushes, I would say Bruce's biography of Calvin is a great way to get into both Calvin and to get a good grasp of the Reformed tradition. I've not yet read his new book on Zwingli, but I imagine that will also serve a similar purpose. So my vote would be, and the book I used in Reformation on Calvin when I used to teach Reformation was Bruce's book or biography of Calvin. So I would say Bruce Gordon.
Yeah. Dr. Gordon, what about you?
Well, yeah, there are many things. Richard Miller's book on Calvin and the Reformed tradition is a very rich book that I think makes the crucial point that, you know, Calvin is extremely important, but we have to read him in his context, and we have to read him with reference to the many people who were around him. And there is a real danger of a kind of Calvin idolatry, that we attribute all of this to one person, and the Reformed tradition was never one person.
Mm-hmm.
It's always seen itself as a collective. This book of biography of Zwingli, which is just coming out, is an attempt to trace the origins of the Reformed tradition, and because in many ways, you know, when in the 1520s, when they come up with the Reformed tradition, if you can put it that way, they've created a new form of Christianity that in many respects has never existed before. There's no blueprint for what becomes the Reformed tradition. You can't clearly say it's there in the medieval church. You can't clearly say it's there in the medieval church. It's a new tradition which has many ancient roots, but it's a new vision of what the church should look like. And that's what makes it exciting and interesting. But I think, you know, my biography of Zwingli is an attempt to try and go back to the origins of it.
Yeah, we might have to have you on again to talk about your book on Zwingli.
Okay, well, I'm happy to come back.
Well, cool. Yeah, thanks for coming on again to talk about this handbook. And I know it's a labor of love, and getting everybody together to make sure that this book is cohesive and logical in that sense. So
you didn't ask us how long it had taken to put together.
No,
how many deadlines?
Yeah, how long
we're not going into that story. It started so long ago that Calvin could have been a contributor.
He was going to do the jacket blurb originally.
That's right.
That's good. Cool. Yeah. So they could see the long canonization process of this Oxford Handbook.
It's well matured. Yeah.
That's right. Cool. Well, thanks again for coming on. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, I hope people pick this up, learn a little bit more about Calvin, biography, his context, and not just kind of the stories that we quote unquote, grew up hearing about Calvin himself.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was good. Bruce, stay in touch. Come and visit. We would love to have you.
I would love to come and visit. I'd love to come and visit. And are you